Thanks for joining us on Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We all know that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, which raises the question of just how many times we can be fooled by the FBI. The events, the mistakes in Florida, are just the latest in a long line. Questions still surround what the FBI knew and what they did with respect to the Boston bombing, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the shootings in San Bernardino, and of course the granddaddy of all screw-ups, the events of 9/11. My guest, Coleen Rowley, was a longtime FBI agent and division legal counsel. She blew the whistle on the FBI's failure to act on information provided by the Minneapolis field office that might have prevented the 9/11 attacks. She ran for Congress in Minnesota, and she continues to write and blog about U.S. policy. It is my pleasure to welcome Coleen Rowley back to Radio Who, What, Why. Coleen, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I want to first talk a little bit about the FBI and whether we should read too much or too little into the events that surrounded what happened in Florida with respect to missing these signals and not acting on the information that they had. Based on what you have seen and read so far, talk a little bit about your take on this.
Well, what came to be known as not connecting the dots after about 2 years of all of the various post-9/11 inquiries turned out to be simply that officials were not reading memos, even with their name on them, even at very high levels. You know, assistant directors, they would have attention so-and-so. And after 9/11, and these would be things like bin Laden going to attack. There was one in April that actually said bin Laden and a Chechen terrorist were going to attack. It had eight or so names on that, and these were high level, director and assistant directors. Afterwards, they claimed they never read it. That was just one of the Phoenix memo was the same. So you find that officials never read the intelligence, and then secondly, never shared it. That's the big story with the CIA not telling the FBI that they were tracking two hijackers for 2 years who had come into California, and they never even told the FBI. To this day, that was never made clear. That was even the official inquiries were never able to get the truth out about why the CIA did not share its information with the FBI. And then finally, the biggest one of all really is the failure to share information with the public, because most of these attacks, when you really analyze them, if they are stopped at all, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, the Times Square bomber, they are stopped by members of the public, not by police. And, of course, that doesn't fit the narrative of, you know, the great FBI and the CIA and whatever. They're protecting us. What people, of course, traumatized and made fearful want to believe that they can be protected. The truth is, and you know, in other times, the law enforcement would tell people, well, we depend upon members of the public. So if you don't come to us as a witness, even in a fraud matter, it doesn't matter whether terrorism or fraud or anything, unless a member of the public lets us in on information, we are not omniscient. So the thing is, 9/11, it was actually easier for a tip or a clue to make its way. In the Musawa case, where I was the whistleblower, is actually a perfect example. That tip, those tips, early tips from a flight school here, who, by the way, they were whistleblowers. The pilots themselves were whistleblowers. That tip made its way to the director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, the head of thousands of CIA, NSA, FBI, in a few days. So that tip came in on August 16th, and George Tenet was briefed. Fundamentalists Learns to Fly on August 23rd. That's amazing. And the reason for that is that the system, unlike what it is today, was not trashed by massive surveillance and vacuuming of data, irrelevant data on all of us, that is now, you know, billions of pieces of data. This is something, you know, with that tip that they look at a tip that came in on a hotline and say, well, the FBI never handled it. But this is the problem right now. The tips, you don't know, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of calls coming in, and not just calls, because the vacuuming is on so many levels. And of course, then it's what we warned from the start. How is it easier to find a needle in a haystack when you continue adding hay to that haystack? And then I and NSA whistleblowers, et cetera, we constantly said this is the dumbest thing in the world to be, creating these massive databases. It makes the job of analysts and people trying to find that one, needle or true threat, the Musawi out there, that it makes their job even harder. You know what the FBI responded to that back, this was after Edward Snowden's disclosures, and it really became apparent. And there was a hearing in Congress, and we're asked precisely that question, because some of us were saying, why continue to create this gigantic haystack? The FBI responded, we need the haystack. So they tried to justify this massive collection. And this is proven over and over and over that now it's even more difficult than it was on 9/11 and even on 9/11. And those problems of not reading, not sharing, and not sharing with the public information, those were never corrected. As far as I know, there still is no mechanism in place that would, an accountability mechanism whereby if a piece of information comes to an official, there is even a way of tracking whether that official has seen it. So then they can just deny afterwards, well, I never read it.
Would something like this be applicable in terms of what happened with the information they got with respect to the shooter in Florida?
Well, yes, of course. Okay, there's several things here that no one, as far as I can see in a mainstream media, is grasping. Number one, well, how many tips are coming in? Because that alone, again, it's all of a numbers game. If one tip came in, like for instance the Musawi case in a highly charged environment, that's very relevant. If someone says we got a terrorist suspect running to fly, very, very relevant. But what if it's one now? Hundreds of thousands. No one asks how many tips are coming into the hotline. And by ginning up fear, most of the tips will not be able, they won't have enough specificity to be acted on. And in many cases, I'll just go back to, the FBI only has jurisdiction over federal crimes and, for instance, international terrorism. If a wife calls up to the FBI hotline and says, my husband is abusing me, he's violent, and you know what? Many of the calls will be like that. That actually is not a federal matter. And so the best they will do with that kind of a tip, I'm being beat up by my husband, is they should, of course, let the local police know. Because the FBI does not treat many of the mass shooters as terrorism. This all goes to that definition of terrorism. Right. Many of them, shooting up the churches, whatever, the FBI, for what, there's political reasons for this, but they don't want to call mass shooters terrorism. And so in a case, probably this case even talking about someone who's a violent, could be a violent school shooter, the failure here is to alert local law enforcement, not for the FBI to take this as its own case. And in this case, local law enforcement, of course, was well aware of this young man because they had disturbances in the neighborhood. He was expelled from school. I read somewhere that the police had 30 prior interactions with him. So whatever additional benefit would have come from the FBI alerting law enforcement, which is the failure, what they failed to do here, it's kind of speculative. So, and that's a problem. I think this idea of terrorism is way too narrow, and that in fact it's violence, whether it's domestic shooters, et cetera. It's a lot more, it doesn't make a lot of sense to draw these distinctions whereby only Arab and Muslim people are considered terrorists and not, race-based or even psychologically based violence that's breaking out.
And how does this relate to situations like Boston or even San Bernardino, where it looks like the FBI had an awful lot of knowledge about the perpetrators before these things happened?
Well, there's one other, this goes back to how many. You have to know the total list. And there are these terrorist lists now of people that they suspect or that potentially could whatever. And they're compiled. The list of people are compiled via all this vacuuming of data. At one point, I've heard there's a million names on the list. Now, this is key because there's about 14,000 FBI agents. This is the same thing that's played out in Europe when they've had these people on their terrorist list, on their watch list. Well, the question is, what can you do? You can't round up a million people and put them in, and of course that would include lots and lots of false positives, because this list, again, it's pretty trashed. It's not a list of people that will carry out things. The FBI has resorted to using I'm going to say entrapment. It's not the right term, but they've resorted to using highly coercive ways of getting people then to play out on what they suspect. That's one of the things they came up with. And they put a lot of people in jail after mostly vulnerable people that are susceptible to that coercion. So that's what they can do. They can't, detail people to follow if there are really thousands, hundreds of thousands, and I've even heard 1 million people on the list. The other thing is, why have we increased the radicalization, the hatred, and actually now with domestic mass shooters, which have tripled, or maybe now they're on their way to quadrupling, the skyrocketing of people with that potential to become violent and to basically just flip out and say, I'm going to, go to a public place, a church, a school, a workplace, a concert. I'm going to go to places where there's lots of people, and I'm going to shoot a lot of people because somehow that will solve my personal problems. The news media will always end their story, and unfortunately these stories are happening almost every other day. In many cases it doesn't result in loss of life like the school one, but there's only a couple. A lot of those school shootings, were only able to kill a couple people. But it's almost every other day that there will be a story like that. And it's almost to the point where those stories are at the end of the news coverage, and it's kind of like, well, this also happened today, a school shooting. But they'll always say the motive. Police are seeking the motive. And that means that they think it's a Perry Mason detective plot. Like there's some real, ingenious motive, or a husband trying to kill a wife or something like that. And in truth, these are senseless acting out of violent impulses. And, go back to that movie, Bowling for Columbine. Why is that now at an epidemic level? And that's what I wrote. I and a co-writer, former Foreign Service officer, we tried to say, well, one of the reasons is this culture that we are now living in that is bombarding us with those violent impulses. The CIA and the Pentagon have been backing, helping make about 1,800 movies. We know about, things like The American Sniper and Zero Dark 30. Those are just a couple of the ones that people have talked about a little bit. There's 1,800 films out there. The plot is always like someone who's wronged. The hero will be someone who's wronged, and then at the end, they shoot everyone, the Terminator, all of these things. Well, a mentally impaired or emotionally troubled person is seeing themselves as that hero in those movies. And essentially, I know it's hard for people to recognize this copycat phenomenon, but even with suicide, this happens. If a person in a Friends commits suicide, that often will have such an impact on that group of people that it will spawn copycat suicides. So our culture is doing this, is promoting this violent culture. And of course, this is over and above the availability and easy access to weapons, even assault weapons and items that you can change. That thing that the Paddock had, which was a little mechanism, he could change his non-automatic weapons to fully automatic. And of course, it was a loophole that made it legal. We can't even put, logical restraints on things like that. You put all of those things together, and that does explain the question, at Columbine. Why is this happening? Why are we experiencing an epidemic of mass violence? And again, our news never mentions that because we want to make it seem, we want to compartmentalize this and make it seem as if it's, easily, it's not us as a culture. It's just, whether you point to mental illness, whether you point to availability of guns, you want to make it something that doesn't reflect badly on our culture.
Given that entertainment today is global and that these movies that you're talking about, television shows, all of this violent imagery is exported around the world, sometimes is even more popular in places around the world than it is here in the U.S., why then is it not having the same impact in other countries? Why is it so sui generis to the United States?
Well, I think the internet, with the showing of, even the beheadings, for instance, are a good example. When ISIS learned that they could have a big impact by showing these terrible, violent beheadings, guess what? It did work, and it was copycatted. It gave oomph to their cause, etc. So you're absolutely right, and it's not just, of course, our Hollywood wanting to make a lot of money by exporting violence. This exporting of films is not that, it's pretty recent, and as it continues, if no one changes the plots, if no one says, for instance, violent video games, I think they're worldwide as well. If no one is able to put a restraint on this and reel it back in, I think that we will see, and in fact we are seeing, especially in Europe, where in the past in Europe there was even homicides were almost negligible. I lived in Paris when I was in college, and I think there was 1 or 2 homicides in all of Paris when I was in college. Well, that's changed and changing. And there's also drug issues, etc. But things are changing even outside the United States. But I will just say we're not doomed as a human race to suffer from this level of violence. Norway, they had Breivik in there as one example of a flip out, violent shootings, horrible, senseless thing. But you look at Norway as a whole and what they do with their prison system and how they handle violence is perhaps the model for the world. Switzerland is another great example. Switzerland, lots and lots of people have guns and weapons. It's a very high per capita ownership of weapons. And yet Switzerland does not have but a tiny, tiny fraction of what we are seeing here in the United States. So we can learn from other places. And what we're doing, in fact, is encourage. Go back to Martin Luther King Jr. and what he, said during the Vietnam War, the height of the Vietnam War. Violence begets violence. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. If you cannot end perpetual war, this is what Martin Luther King said all the way back in 1967. If we cannot end perpetual war, we will approach spiritual death and physical death as well. I added the physical death because this is playing out in a myriad of our war that we are so flippant about because we believe it's only killing foreigners. But the blowback from sustaining perpetual war is this violence that we're seeing now and experiencing domestically. I think if people could understand that there are costs to 16, now going on 17 years of perpetual war. This is one of the blowbacks. There are many others. If they could understand that it's negatively impacting ourselves, that there would be then some political will to rein this in.
How do we begin to prove that? How do we begin to make the point empirically that this perpetual war is having this impact?
Well, there's a couple of little, minor beginnings to this. And when I and former Foreign Service Officer Robert Wing wrote our op-ed, we only had a couple of things that we could point to. But one of the things I, of course, long recognized, because I worked in the FBI when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma federal building. And, of course, immediately recognized, well, he's a product of Gulf War I. He served in Gulf War I, and he somehow was, became, whatever you want to call it, PTSD, emotionally troubled, etc., vulnerable to the notion that violence is the answer, certainly. And so then I saw, well, it wasn't just Timothy McVeigh, who was a veteran who had become a domestic terrorist. There was also John Mohammed. He was a product of Gulf War I. He shot, I think, 17 people out of their cars and absolutely terrorized Washington. And then there was another guy, Flores, who shot his professors, 3 or 4 professors out, and got a bad grade, solved my personal problems by shooting my professors. These 3 were all products of Gulf War I. So anecdotally, I thought, well, oh my gosh, veterans are turning out to have this problem now of being more susceptible to violence. And now there's been 2 studies. One was in the New York Times by a scientist type person, and one was one of my anti-war. David Swanson actually did the same thing. He looked at stats and stuff, and both of them came up with the same conclusion. Thus far, veterans are twice as likely to now become some of these mass shooters. And again, in our news coverage, if it's mentioned at all, with the Parkland shooter, he was in junior ROTC. But with the shooter of the police, the guy who ambushed police in Texas, he was a veteran. The Navy Yard shooter, there's quite a number. And so that's anecdotal, but then you just start analyzing the numbers, and you find out it's pretty significant. This isn't like the 3% error rate. This is twice as likely. One of our Homeland Security analysts had written this very early on, that this would be part of the blowback, and he got disparaged and was actually forced to quit by even putting it into a Homeland Security. Tom Ridge, head of Homeland Security, after the Newtown shooting, he actually said, look at violent video games as a major cause, and he got hushed up right away. He said it once about the violent video games being one of the causations, and he was hushed up. So there's just the beginnings, but it would be empirically possible if we put as much time and attention into cause and effect and correlations as we do in ginning up. Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. If we put that much time and effort into proving, I put proving in quotes there, cause and effect, we would certainly be able to see this. And already there's some proof.
Coleen Rowley, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on Radio Who, What, Why.
Yes, anytime, and let's cross our fingers. But news coverage of this is right now counterproductive. It's sensationalizing and exploiting even the tragedy of the victims, which is going to, unfortunately, that's going to cause even more. We need more political will to stop this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.